This is not the Gatekeeper chassis I remember. What's going on, everyone? This is the Element Enduro Gatekeeper. This is the newest release from Element at this time, and we're going to go over today the details exactly of what you see here in front of you. But before we get into all of the details, let's just run through the basics of what you see here. First thing you'll notice is the obvious, the chassis, the look of this chassis. We've got a tube chassis style vehicle now sitting here in front of us, but in the end, this is actually the Element Enduro that you guys already know. We've got the same Enduro chassis underneath with now a plastic cage that rests on top and is hingeable to get out of your way for easy access to everything underneath. Element obviously has both the solid axle and IFS versions of the Enduro, but on this one, we stay with solid axle. In the rear, also solid axle like all of the rest. However, on this one now we've got a new trailing arm rear suspension. Along with that trailing arm suspension, we also see an increased wheelbase to 12.8 inches. This will be the longest wheelbase available on an Enduro at this point. That new trailing arm rear suspension incorporates a new sway bar setup as well. The transmission on the inside, the exact same transmission that we've seen on all of the rest of the Enduros so far. This version of this truck comes as a builder's kit, so you have to assemble everything. The body panels come clear, you'll need to paint them yourselves. You will also need to provide all of the electronics, an ESC, a motor, your servo, and your radio and receiver. Now we're going to jump in depth on this vehicle, showing you all of the new updates, all of the differences, some running footage, and everything about the setup you see here in front of you. I have a short list of the tools that you'll need, or that I used at least, during building this, and I'll link to those in the description below as well. Now first, let's talk about the Enduro base underneath and what's been changed or updated so that you know exactly what's different from any of the other Enduros maybe you've had experience with before in the past. First thing to note is that all of the plastics on the truck, as far as like on the drivetrain area, have all been updated to the hard plastics that you may have seen as option parts previously. And now that is this gray colored plastic. So you'll notice that a lot of the parts on this are this gray color. No longer are they the black that you saw on the previous like Sendero, Trail Walker, Trail Runner, any of the other ones that I'm forgetting. So other than the change to the hard plastic for a lot of the drivetrain, as you can see here, there are some other changes. One that is very noticeable is that this now has a trailing arm rear suspension. So it's got these short little trailing arms in the rear, and to actually mount those to the chassis, there's these new plastic slider bases that go here on the outside of the frame rails. Those give you that rear mount for the trailing arm, moves everything back. It's a very short trailing arm. It's actually a lot shorter than the regular link would have been, but moves it back, gets everything out of the way, lets it clear and cycle freely, and it also keeps them fairly parallel to the truck, which is a nice touch for performance on trailing arms on an RC car. Now, that hard plastic is also meant to be a little bit stiffer, a little bit stronger, but one thing that they changed even further is the panhard mount. Now, the panhard mount on some of the Element trucks has been a weak point, known to be that way, hangs down a long ways from the chassis and just has a lot of leverage on it. There's a new updated design on this vehicle now that gives you an adjustable aluminum panhard mount. It's a two-piece design. There's a base plate that bolts to the chassis rails themselves, and then there's another aluminum part that bolts to that, and you can put it in one of 3 different positions. It'll help you either tune the exact angle of the panhard bar, and depending on the ride height and servo position, you may want to do that. In the instructions, it shows installing it in the middle position. Me personally, I moved it to the very top position to give myself as much axle clearance as possible. Now, making the panhard mount a separate piece meant redesigning the shock towers. And during that redesign, they went with a completely new style, and it's got now an aluminum insert that goes in the top portion where the shocks actually thread onto, and that as well has multiple hole positions to allow you to move the shocks around, but it's nice that you're threading into aluminum rather than plastic. You'll be able to move it around freely without worries of actually stripping the plastic out. Now, the rear shock towers, however, are completely new because they're in a different position. With a shock mounted to a trailing arm, the upper mount also has to be moved forward because, of course, where it would normally be mounted to the axle would be much further back on the chassis. So everything had to move forward. With this new shock tower design, everything moved further and they're braced from side to side in the rear. Now, you can, of course, see the cage that's on top of this, but it's a little bit deceiving because underneath is still the regular Enduro that you're used to, and this whole cage hinges forward. Now, this makes access to everything underneath super easy, as you can see here. Lifted this thing up, everything's here. This is a ready to run truck. Currently, I still have my Genzace 4300 milliamp battery pack installed in here from my running earlier today. To hinge this cage up, you just pull two simple body clips in the rear, and that's when everything then pops forward. This hinged chassis body design on this truck is something that's very Ultra 4 style, and it actually looks to be very clearly modeled after a Trent Fab car. Trent Fab is a company that makes full-size Ultra 4 vehicles, and they have some very distinct styling, including this small little step-up area in this front, A-pillar area, as well as you'll see this crossing B-pillar, something also you see very often in their cars. If you just type in Trent Fab Ultra 4, you're not gonna have to look very hard to see some very specific styling cues that this vehicle shares. I like the overall style of the cage. Trent Fab cars, I think, look great. This obviously looks a lot like that. The body panels have some nice depth to them. You've got, more than just a flat hood. It's got a little bit of kick down, and it also has a little hood scoop there. The roof is just a flat panel with, the curves in the right areas. Nothing too special there. The sides, though, wrap around and into that inner front fender well, kind of helping enclose things so you don't see into the vehicle easily. Some nice detail was put into that to help make this thing still look like a decent scale truck rather than just a cage on top of the other platform. And of course, the interior, a nice just interior cover with a couple of drivers. It's very shallow. There's not much depth at all just because of everything that sits underneath. But I think that they added nice detail, and I actually really like this style of interior. So I think that's a win. Behind the interior, we've got a molded radiator set and a little fuel cell. One thing to note is, in case you were gonna start thinking about trying to use that as your receiver box or anything, think twice, because that is mounted to the cage. So it comes up with the cage. So unless you want some really long wires going around, that's not gonna work for that. If you wanted to get creative, I think you could probably remove it from the cage, remove a little bit of the material on the bottom side, and then mount it to this rear cross brace. And I think that that could then become your receiver box. The hinge point is at the front of the vehicle. And one thing to note is that while it does hinge, it kind of stops at about this point here where you can see. Nothing is holding it there. There's a lot of stress put on the front of the cab there. I wish that there was actually like some sort of, limiting strap or prop rod that we could have to hold that in place. Now, underneath of this hinged caged body, the platform underneath is very similar to what you've seen before, but there are some significant differences. We talked about the sliders already being a little bit different because they help mount those trailing arms. Now, because of the size of this hinged cage, they're much narrower before, like much narrower. So much narrower, in fact, that there is no more room for the receiver box that Element previously included. So now they give you a small plate that blocks off where the winch servo went. You screw that in place and it gives you a small platform in the front of the vehicle to mount some electronics. I chose to mount my Futaba receiver up there in a little 3D printed enclosure that I made just for fun. However, just my receiver alone pretty much would have filled up that area. I mean, you could start stacking things, but depending on the size of the ESC that you're running, you're starting to kind of get tight on room. Now, there's no other real great flat areas. If you've got some small ESCs, you might be able to mount them on the side, but you need to make sure that everything is pretty clear of things so that you can flip things up. There's a nice mounting place right here on this back shock tower. It's super easy, and I think that it would make a great place for an ESC tray. That is something that I think I can just draw up quickly in Fusion and 3D print. And I'll go ahead and I'll run through that, just something super simple. So if you guys want to, you can print it out yourself, and I'll just link to it in the description below. Now, I didn't have to go that route. I didn't need a place to put my ESC because for this one, I'm testing out one of the Hobbywing Quick Run Fusion setups, and that is the motor and ESC combo. It's all in one. It's the length of a 550 can, but it's a 540 motor and an ESC tagged on the back. This is basically a axe setup but more compact. The axe setups have not been my favorite in the past, but for the convenience factor alone, I wanted to try this setup and we dropped it in here. But I will say, for this truck, this thing was ideal. And the Element runs a 550 length motor without any problem or any interference. The battery tray in front of it still has a comfortable amount of space between the motor and that battery. No worries at all. Speaking of the battery, it has the stubby size battery tray installed in here, and it only fits the stubby size battery tray. You cannot run a full size battery in this setup. This cage is narrow to try and make, the style and performance of one of these, Ultra 4 type vehicles. So to do that, to make everything work, they did have to limit you to this narrower size. It's a trade-off that had to be made, and I think it was a reasonable one at that. For me, I'm running the Gens Ace Adventure Series 4300 milliamp lithium high volt pack. Fits in there nice. It's got great runtime. It packs a lot into a pretty small area. So 4300 milliamp stubby pack like this in 3S works well. I got almost 3 hours of runtime on just one pack while filming. So now, trailing arm suspension does have its side effects. It can make a truck perform very differently, some for the better, some not so much. One effect is that it can make or accentuate torque twist quite a bit. And one solution to kind of remedy that is adding a sway bar. And that has been included in this kit. It's a really nice setup. It's got some end links that go down and also attach to those trailing arms. It's a solid piece overall and something you could really tell was working. For those of you guys who are trying to get max flex, you could take off that sway bar and get tons of wheel travel, but it's not something I would suggest if you actually want the best performance out of this truck. Other details on the suspension: the front lower links are now of a high clearance design, meaning they have a bend in them just past the front axle, trying to just give you a little bit more clearance as this kind of comes off of the rocks. A nice little update. However, they were not shown in the instruction set that I had. So I had these links, I had the instructions, and I had to kind of figure it out by process of elimination. But a nice upgrade, just needs to be noted in the manual. There are several other updates or little things that I think are specifically worth noting if you've either built Element kits or owned Element RTRs in the past. First of all, these now have metal hexes. Previously, all of the Element trucks I've built had plastic hexes, and seeing that they finally put metal hexes in there was a nice addition. Also on the rear axles, they now use a very large washer head style screw to hold in those rear bearings, just making everything a little bit more secure. There's metal pivot balls included for all of the links rather than plastic pivot balls. Yet another just simple but nice upgrade to see in the kit. And then there was also a 25 tooth metal servo horn included. I ended up using a different servo horn, but it was nice to see that value included in the kit. It's a non-clamping design, but a solid servo horn nonetheless. That's a little bit of an overview of the truck. I want to go through exactly the setup that I've got in front of you here. And then we're going to get onto some of my feelings during building the kit, and lastly, some run footage. Now, the actual setup that you see here in front of you. Like I mentioned, I'm using the Hobbywing Quick Run Fusion motor and ESC all-in-one setup. I'm using the 1800 kV option. That's the fastest option they offer in that setup. For me, it's a little bit slow. I like more wheel speed, so it was on the slower side. I decided to go with a 20-tooth pinion for mine. I feel like I could have maybe gone a little higher, maybe like a 22, and just monitor the temperatures. For this truck, I think that it was a good motor choice, but I just wish it was still a little bit faster. For the servo, I'm using a Power Hobbies direct power style. So that means that there's actual power wire that goes from the servo to my battery lead. Super fast, tons of power, performed great. I really enjoyed running that. For my radio, I'm running a Futaba 4PM with a 2106 GF receiver. And lastly, for the battery, it's a Gens Ace 4300 milliamp Adventure Series lithium high volt 3S pack. The wheels are Vanquish Method 101s in bronze with black hardware on the ring. I've got 350 hubs all the way around with additional stainless steel brake weights on the front. I've got Proline Hyraxes on here in the Predator compound. In the rear, I'm running Crawler Innovations single stage heavyweight Crawler Innovation foams. In the front, I'm running Crawler Innovations Little Nova foams in a 2-stage setup with a soft outer and the heavyweight inner. For the shocks, I'm running the stock 300 CST fluid that was included in the kit. The shocks that are included on the kit, very typical Associated, super nice quality. They went together fantastic and they performed well the entire time I ran them. So now let's get into some of the notes that I had about building this truck throughout the process. The new hard plastics are nice to see. They are very stiff, but assembly was pretty easy overall. I did use a power driver for most of the building of this kit just because there is a lot of screws. One thing to note about all of those screws, specifically in the cage, is pay really close attention to the length of the screw that is needed for each of the parts. They're all over the map. It's not like a super consistent size or anything like that. That's a little bit of a pain. I would always rather see, more consistent length screws throughout steps like that, but not a huge deal. Just pay attention while you're building that kit. I mentioned that the high clearance links weren't shown in the version of the manual I have. There's also a spacer that goes in between the rear link mounts, and then the trailing arm goes on the outside. That was very unclear or not present in the instructions. Something that I'm sure those will get updated either hopefully by the first delivery of them, or if not, by the second. So just little things to note. The instructions overall, not too bad, but just a couple of typos that had happened in this first round. This kit still runs 48 pitch spur gears. Really wish that they had finally gone to 32 pitch. 48 pitch is nice for low noise, but for strength, it's just not that great. And also, at least my kit didn't include a pinion. So make sure you pick up a pinion. If you don't have 48 pitch pinions, like I didn't, make sure you pick up a 48 pitch pinion. I went with a 22. It's reasonable, but for me, liking a little bit more wheel speed, I'll probably jump up to at least a 22 at this point. And lastly, like I mentioned before, I wish this cage just had some sort of stop because it doesn't rotate freely all the way forward, and I can just tell that this is not great to let it float up there like that. As far as the running part of it goes, we're going to show you the running footage now here in a minute, but I'm going to give you just a few of the things that I noticed while running it. First of all, it's Ultra 4 style, really, highlighting the performance of a full buggy style vehicle. The width of this truck is very narrow as far as the actual cage and body section. That's very noticeable on the trail. You can really put this thing in tough positions and it kind of just finds its way through. I really enjoy that. The overall cage itself is durable. It took some big tumbles for me. I had no issues as far as anything like that went. It's got lots of scrapes and rash all over it. I tested it thoroughly as far as that part goes. I think that this cage is going to be something that holds up pretty well. One thing about the cage though that I think is worth noting. On a buggy like this, I would normally like to see the front of this cage pushed further back. They couldn't necessarily do that because they're still just using the Enduro platform underneath, and to have the bumper cross braces and everything that was needed, it pushed out the front. So it still feels like you're driving a truck with a bumper out there because you're always coming up to this first. You're not really allowed to just get the tires up against a vertical face and be able to pull yourself up. You're always still hitting that front bumper. So it's almost there as far as giving you the feel of it like a real buggy style vehicle. It just falls a little bit short in that area, and my front bumper definitely shows scars to prove that that is an area that you're really going to notice up there. There's a lot of open space between this front bumper and where your servo is. There's almost enough room to put a whole receiver box up there. So that is one thing that I really wish was improved, but at the same time, totally understand why there was nothing that could be done about that without retooling a good chunk of what sits underneath of this. But now that we've got through all of that talking part, we're going to jump into the running footage. But before we do, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already. So let's show you guys what this thing does on the rocks.